Hi, everyone.
Hi, folks. We're in John Wesley Brady's book, this Freedom Whence, and we're in part 1 of the book now, and he has entitled this section, An Age of Expiring Hopes. And he starts by referring to the work of R.H. Tawney, that great historian and economist who lived about a century ago, who talks about the birth of democracy and modern freedoms, where it all came from. And here's what Tawney has to say in this intro to the chapter that Brady entitles Triple Tragedies. Tawney says, "The foundation of democracy is the sense of spiritual independence which nerves the individual to stand alone against the powers of this world, and in England, where squire and parson, lifting arrogant eyebrows at the insolence of the lower orders, combine to crush popular agitation as a menace at once to society and to the church, it is probable that democracy, that is in England, owes more to nonconformity than to any other single movement." Now that we don't use that word anymore, capital N, nonconformity. It only means independent Protestantism. The forms of Protestantism that were in continual nonconformity to the Church of England and the Catholic Church, which had been battling for the control of England for the previous 150 years before the Wesleys came along. So Tawney's opinion is that democracy owes more to nonconformity, dissenting Protestantism, than to any other single movement. So he starts his chapter, Triple Tragedies, with this: "Morality and religion have collapsed to a degree that has never been known in any Christian country." So wrote the famous Bishop Berkeley in 1738, the very year of John Wesley's conversion, in his, that is Berkeley's, Discourse to Magistrates and Men in Authority. "Our prospect," Berkeley averred, "is very terrible, and the symptoms grow worse from day to day. The accumulating torrent of evil which threatens a general inundation and destruction of these realms he attributed chiefly to the irreligion and bad example of those styled the better sort." Then, pleading with all state officials to mend their ways and consider well the future of their country, he continued, quote, "The youth born and brought up in wicked times without any bias to good from early principle or instilled opinion, when they grow ripe, must be monsters indeed. And it is to be feared that the age of monsters is not far off." This again is the famous philosopher Berkeley, also an Anglican bishop, in the year 1738. To which Brady comments, "Berkeley's place in history is that of a philosopher, not a moralist. He disliked both enthusiasm, that is the more common religion, and exaggeration. He was accustomed to weigh well the purport of his words, and in 1738 his influence was at its height. If, however, his fears seem extreme and we turn to the records of his contemporaries, a host might be cited to the same end, wittingly or unwittingly, and from vastly different angles: Fielding, Defoe, Swift, Bolingbroke, Pope, Gay, Addison, Butler, Walpole, and Johnson." Those are all the most famous writers of that period.
Yeah.
"Offer evidence of the moral and spiritual eclipse with which the earlier half of the 18th century was threatened. Historians, too, of widely divergent schools on this issue are singularly agreed. Examine Lecky, Stephen, Macaulay, Green, Overton, Abbey, Robertson, Trevelyan, Halevi, and Temperley, and it will be found that none would seriously dispute Berkeley's verdict."
The fact, then, of a tragic moral collapse at this period is indisputable. The manifold causes of that collapse, though interrelated, are more elusive. 3, nevertheless, are unmistakable and are of vital importance to the unfolding of our subject. The first would be the anti-puritan purge. First among these 3 causes was the anti-puritan code of persecution, passed between 1661 and 1665. Charles II, in his Declaration, signed at Breda before his return to England, had promised a general amnesty, including liberty to tender consciences. The ensuing carnival of triumphant royalism, however, swept all before it. In April 1661, the king's coronation was solemnized. Is that how you say it? Solemnized? Amidst scenes of elaborate pomp. Adroitly, too, a general election was staged, almost to synchronize with the coronation pageant, thus exploiting its flamboyant passions. Hence, the Cavalier Parliament, now overwhelmingly elected, consisted chiefly of hot royalists and hot churchmen, whose dominant idea of religion was a revengeful hatred of everything savoring of Commonwealth association or influence.
That is the Puritans.
Mm-hmm.
Anti-Puritans. Already the bodies of Cromwell, Bradshaw, and Ireton had been torn from their graves and gibbeted at Tyburn. Those were the more prominent Puritans. The Solemn League and Covenant was burned. That is, the Puritan Covenant was burned by the common hangman in Westminster Hall. More than a dozen regicides, that is, people who had been thought to be desiring the assassination of the king, were executed, and large numbers of Puritans were cast into jail, while the royalist squires, lawyers, and bishops, not to be outdone by the mob spirit they had stimulated, proceeded by legislative enactment to exterminate, root, stem, and branch the monstrous heresy from every department of the nation's life. So the monstrous heresy is Puritanism, and the reason it's so hated by the powerful is that the Puritans have succeeded in executing the Catholic King of England, Charles I. So you can understand why they felt...
They were viewed as fanatics, right? They were very taking it seriously, their religion.
They were certainly serious.
Mm-hmm. The first legislative thrust in the Cavalier purge was against municipalities and was designed to kill all Puritan influence on legislation. For the members of municipal bodies controlled the election of members of Parliament. By the Corporation Act, 1661, all holders of municipal office had to swear a solemn oath that they would not, on any pretext whatever, take up arms against or resist the king. They had to repudiate the Solemn League and Covenant and to pronounce it an illegal document, while also they had to receive the sacrament according to the rites of the Church of England. The Corporation Act, however, was but a prelude to the really deadly assault. The Act of Uniformity, the Conventicle Act, and the 5 Mile Act stabbed at the heart of Puritan religion, Puritan ideals, Puritan education, and Puritan culture. Together they represented the most nefarious and most un-British legislation ever passed on the statute books of England.
In preparation for the Act of Uniformity, that is 1662, the prayer book was revised by convocation in an anti-Puritan direction to the extent of several hundred alterations. Then the stage set, every clergyman and schoolmaster, by the clauses of this act, had to declare his unfeigned assent and consent to the use of all things in the said book contained and prescribed in these words and in no other. That's a direct quote. One clause of the oath reads, quote, I, so-and-so, do declare that it is not lawful upon any pretense whatever to take arms against the king, and that I will conform to the liturgy of the Church of England, as it is now by law established, end of quote. He had to repudiate and pronounce illegal the Solemn League and Covenant, that is the Protestant covenant, that is the Puritan covenant rather, and to pledge himself not to seek to make any change in the constitution of church or state. And so through 29 quarto pages, that's large pages, this vindictive act and blusters on, even stipulating that the nation was to act toward any refusing to subscribe, quote, as though the person or persons so offending were dead, unquote.
Well, that sounds familiar.
The immediate result of this act was that nearly 2,000 rectors and vicars, that is, clergymen, whose consciences were not subservient to the dictates of state, were turned adrift from their livings without compensation, and among them were such eminent pastors and scholars as Baxter, Howe, and Calamy. Among them, too, were Dr. Samuel Annesley and John Wesley, the grandfathers, and Dr. Bartholomew Wesley, a great-grandfather of the famous 18th century evangelist.
This expulsion represented 1/5 of the entire English clergy, men whose zeal and labor had diffused throughout the country a greater appearance of piety and religion than it had ever displayed before. The famous historian J.R. Green, an Anglican clergyman, says of this expulsion, "No such sweeping alteration in the religious aspect of the church had ever been seen before. The rectors and vicars who were driven out were the most learned and most active of their order. It was the definitive expulsion of a great party which from the time of the Reformation had played the most active and popular part in the life of the church. The Church of England," says Green, "stood from that moment isolated and alone among the churches of the Christian world. It sank into immobility. With the expulsion of the Puritan clergy, all change, all efforts after reform, all natural development suddenly stopped."
Good place to pause.
Yeah.
I know this period greatly impressed you when you first found out about it.
Yeah, we had some lectures at our church on church history, and this was one of the things that was talked about, the Puritans, and this act that expelled all the clergy that were Puritan
In sympathy.
in sympathy. And there's this book that I wanted to just show you is called Farewell Sermons. And I think this was one of the books that was referred to in the lectures. It contains 24 of the 31 sermons of those ministers. And I had read the paperback, which was, I think that one has, let's see, it says in here, 9 sermons from the time. And their prayers, their final sermon before being ejected. They're very moving. I would recommend reading them, and the prayers too. You cannot think of these men as anything but godly when you read their tenderness towards their flock and their desire, what they wanted. This is beautiful reading.
So you, as an ex-Jehovah's Witness, you got to know that there were godly people long before Charles Taze Russell.
For sure.
And they were willing to pay the price.
And that there's been struggles all through history. And for people who take their belief seriously, there's always struggle.
We wanted to attach, link to this video here, 2 segments we did on JWs and their view of disfellowshipping. There's really only 2 references to church in the mouth of Jesus Christ in the 4 Gospels. 2 times he mentions church. They're in Matthew 16 and Matthew 18. And in Matthew 18 he tells you what to do with a stubborn, non-repentant fellow believer. Take the issue to the church, he says. If you fail and you and a friend fails, take it to the church. He assumes the existence of a community, and a community with disciplining power. So there is a video here on that. What does that look like in the Jewish context in the 1st century? And also a follow-up video we did on 1 Corinthians, the classic JW disfellowshipping tense. I guess I should say, for those of you who don't know what a JW is, a Jehovah's Witness, what do they do with these disfellowshipping texts, as they call them, specifically the one they use the most, 1 Corinthians 5, expel the wicked man from among yourselves. So those 2 videos are on your screen.